My next guest is AJ Flick, a former reporter for the much-missed Tucson Citizen, where I had my first job in the newspaper business as a paper boy. AJ has just published her first book, Toxic Rage, A Tale of Murder in Tucson. The book examines the 2004 brutal murder for hire of Dr. Brian Stidham. AJ, welcome to Zone of Politics.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
So anybody who lived in Tucson back in 2004 remembers this story, but talk a little bit about who Brian Stidham was and how he came to be murdered.
Brian Stidham was a very popular, very talented children's eye surgeon. And he was hired by another eye surgeon, Dr. Brad Schwartz, to come to Tucson and take over the children's eye practice in Dr. Schwartz's office. And suddenly, one night, his body was found stabbed to death in the parking lot of his medical complex.
And he'd had a falling out with his medical partner,
Yes.
Bradley Schwartz.
That's right. There had been previously, while they were working together, Dr. Schwartz had some personal issues, and he was self-medicating with Vicodin, some ailments of his, and was charged in federal court along with his fiancée at the time, Lourdes Lopez, a former prosecutor. And while he was being charged in federal court, his office was raided. Brian was a little cautious about working with him after that, and Brian was trying to break off, and then Schwartz ended up firing him. And from that, and from the legal case that ensued regarding Dr. Schwartz, where his medical license was taken away, he had to go to rehab, he had to work to get his practice back, and that's what prosecutors said caused this toxic rage that led to Dr. Schwartz hiring a hitman to kill Brian Stidham.
And it was a very brutal crime. And talk a little bit about Brad Schwartz. I mean, Type A doesn't even really seem to cover his personality.
Yes, their personalities were vastly different. You had Brian, who was calm and friendly, and then you had Brad Schwartz, who was aggressive in many ways and very. He's from New York State, and it's that kind of what you might call a New York State attitude, very in your face. And when he came to Tucson to start a practice, he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. But he also was a very talented eye surgeon himself, and quite the ladies' man.
Yes, it sounds like. And among his paramours was, as you mentioned, a former prosecutor from the Pima County Attorney's Office, Lourdes Lopez. And that really dragged in the Pima County Attorney's Office into the middle of this case, and some prosecutors lost their job. But unwind that a little bit.
Yeah, it was very involved with a lot of the doings of the prosecutor's office. Lourdes, when she was engaged to Dr. Schwartz, and she was prosecuted in federal court as well.
For the drug charges.
For the drugs, because he had been writing Vicodin prescriptions and giving them to her to fill, and then she would take some Vicodin, he would take the most of it. And he did that with other people as well. So when she was in the prosecutor's office, she knew that she was going to be indicted in federal court. So Barbara Lawal, the county attorney, asked her to resign. And later, it comes into play where Lourdes is not working in the prosecutor's office, but still had many contacts, many friends in the prosecutor's office.
And she was no longer engaged to Brad Schwartz at that point, right?
Eventually, yeah. The last year or so was not engaged to him. But at the time, one of the other prosecutors was throwing a charity party that he does every year. And the issue came up of whether Lourdes, who had been disgraced, would be invited, and should they be in her presence. And that became an issue with several other prosecutors, where they were fired, and they fought their firings, and brought a lot of issues like that to light that we didn't know about in the prosecutor's office.
Right, because after she heard about the murder, she she knew right away it was probably Brad Schwartz who had.
She suspected, but she still had a lot of denial, but she actually became the main accuser, the person who put it all together, and talked about how Brad had many times said, I'm going to kill him, I'm going to have him killed. He apparently had said that to a number of people who were all, brought into the case, but nobody believed him. Everybody thought, well, everybody says that, I'm so mad I could kill you. But then the person doesn't usually turn up dead.
Right, and in this case, he had hired a hitman.
Yes.
Who
Very unlikely hitman.
How so?
Well, I mean, if you had to hire a hitman, Bruce Bigger would not be, the first person most people would choose. That he was from Indiana. He was a drug addict, and he really did not have a violent criminal history. Some fights, and oftentimes in these fights, he was the one who was being beaten up. So it's not like you would just say, oh, look at this guy, and yeah, he's the guy I want to kill my former partner or anything like that. And so it was very unusual. And it was also very unusual that Brian was stabbed to death. Very unusual for hits to happen like that. Bruce Bigger had access to a gun, and normally you would think if you're going to kill someone for someone else, you're not going to get up close. Brian Stidham had no defensive wounds, but he had multiple stab wounds.
And where is Bradley Schwartz today?
Bradley Schwartz is serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole in the Arizona State Prison System.
And the hitman, Bigger.
Yes, he is serving life without parole in prison.
And how did you come to write this book?
I was working for the Tucson Citizen. I was covering the courts, and at first when I was actually right up the road when Dr. Stidham was killed, but once it became a court case, once they arrested Brad Schwartz and Bruce Bigger, it went from the cop reporters to me. So I covered the court case from the very beginning. And after one of the trials, Schwartz was tried first and then Bigger, a publisher actually came to me and said, how'd you like to write a book? And which almost every reporter loves to hear those words.
No kidding.
And so I said, I'd love to. After Bigger's trial, then I basically over about 3 months wrote this book. And we almost went to print, but for some other technical reasons, it never got published. And so I kind of put it on a back burner as the Citizen closed, and I had to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And picked it up from time to time. And then in the last couple of years, I met this publisher with Wild Blue Press out of Colorado. Other true crime author friends that I knew recommended him. And so he said, yes, I'll publish it. So,
why do you think there's still interest in this case all these years later?
I asked that very question because every once in a while I'll get called for a true crime show to talk about this case, and there's one coming up on Discovery ID about this case again, even after all this time. And I asked one of the producers, and he said, it's the people. First of all, to have someone like Brian Stidham murdered, it's very unusual. He's not, popular doctors don't show up dead every day. And then you have another doctor accused of hiring this unlikely hitman, and a former prosecutor who was engaged to Dr. Schwartz being the main accuser. It's got these twists and turns that even, I found out, and you'll have to read the book, that these twists and turns are continuing to this very day. This case still has surprises. I was very interested when I was looking through the appeals.
That's a great tease.
Yes.
For people to pick up the book.
Absolutely.
My guest today, AJ Flick, talking about her new book, Toxic Rage, and we will be right back with Susan Fries from Literacy Connects.